Okay, so let's dive in. We're going to talk about trauma and the neurobiological underpinnings of trauma. So a little bit of background about me. So I specialize in neurofeedback and something called quantitative electroencephalograph, which is QEG for short, which in other words is basically just brain maps. So I also specialize in brain spotting, which is a particular psychotherapeutic tool that helps to discharge trauma. I'm also a biofeedback certification International Alliance Senior Fellow, which means I've been doing biofeedback and neurofeedback for just a really long time. For the past 7 years, I've been working at a long-term residential facility for complex developmental trauma. So we worked primarily with students that were adopted or were coming from impoverished communities. And so I have a lot of experience with complex developmental trauma. And I have a lot of experience with something called DDP, which is dyadic developmental psychotherapy. Currently, I'm in private practice. I recently left the long-term residential facility and I do neurofeedback counseling, remote neurotherapy, and sensory integration at Lake of the Ozarks. So if you guys know the show Ozarks, that's where I am. Okay, so the types of trauma that I want to talk about, and we have three main ones. We have PTSD, and PTSD is essentially there's an event or a sequence of extremely stressful experiences that really contribute to symptoms of hypervigilance, anxiety. These are people that when they walk into stores, they're kind of scanning. They don't like people behind them. You know, when they go to restaurants, they're kind of sitting in the booth with their back against the wall. PTSD is going to be your kind of quintessential, veteran that comes back from war and, can't sleep or can't kind of continue to be a part of society because their anxiety is so high. Other examples would be some type of sexual abuse, some type of physical domestic violence, even bullying, online bullying, even when kids go on TikTok and make really terrible videos of each other. That can cause a PTSD response. The complex developmental trauma is the one that I have the most experience with. And so with complex developmental trauma, you're really looking at kind of developmental trauma, meaning that the person really grew up with very stressful environments. And so one example of that is something called the primal wound. And this is something that not a lot of people talk about or really recognize. But when you're working with adoption, and again, when I worked at the long-term residential facility, we worked with a lot of adoption. You're getting kids that are coming from different countries like Guatemala and China and Russia. And in some cases, they're being removed from their mothers or relinquished from their mothers, or even in some cases where an adopted parent or adoptive parent wants to adopt a child and they're in the delivery room. The separation between the mother and the child can create what's called the primal wound, which is it comes out of something called interpersonal neurobiology. And interpersonal neurobiology is just kind of a fancy word of saying that we impact each other emotionally and we impact each other's physiology. So, if you're spending time with a group of people that are anxious, there's a strong possibility that you're going to start to feel anxiety or you're going to feel anxious. Or if you walk into a room and there's a bunch of people that are calm, there's a strong possibility that you can start to feel calm too, because we affect each other emotionally. Now, mother-child dynamic is really the quintessential element of interpersonal neurobiology, because really when the infant is born, it really is still a part of its mom. And so when you separate the infant from the mother, it can create this kind of neurobiological sense of abandonment or, something is missing in my life. Quite literally feel a feeling of losing a part of yourself. So that's one kind of part of complex developmental trauma. Another one would just be kind of physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. So if you grew up in a household that, maybe there was physical abuse or something of that nature, essentially what happens is that the brain kind of goes into a survival state. And then the last one is really just going to be neglect, either emotional or physical neglect. So emotional neglect can look like you can be a child and you can have all of your needs met, but if there is a lack of emotional support, if there's a lack of care and consideration, there's a lack of that kind of in the household, that can also contribute to the development of complex developmental trauma. So the last one I want to talk about is generational trauma, and this one is one that has been gaining a lot more traction lately. And the reason for that is something called epigenetics. And epigenetics is this concept, like in the, I don't know, in the 90s and the early 2000s, social scientists kind of had this argument of nature versus nurture. So, as a human being, are you successful because of your genetics? Just because you had good genetics, you now can be successful no matter what? Or did it have to do with, nurture, meaning your parents supported you and you were in a good environment, you went to good schools. And so all of those kind of conditions really, allowed you to be successful in your life. And epigenetics kind of just combines them together and says, well, actually, the truth of the matter is it's both. So the reality is that you have multiple different types of capacities for genetic expression. And to be very clear about that, you have the ability to both be, and I'm going to be dramatic here, but you have both the ability to be very violent, or you have the capacity to be very compassionate. And so given the environmental conditions that you're in, will express those particular capacities. So if you find yourself in an impoverished community, the genetic expression of violence will emerge into your system. Whereas if you find yourself in a very kind of loving and supportive community, then that kind of compassionate side of you will emerge out of your DNA. So the idea here is that you can pass down trauma from parent and grandparent to child. So you can pass down kind of these this shame or this feeling of brokenness, this feeling of unworthiness, or this feeling of survival. And so a lot of times, you'll see this in families where the grandparents and the child of the grandparent and then the child of the child, they all kind of have similar experience, kind of like the quintessential, when you get into your 30s and 40s, you kind of turn into your mom or you turn into your dad. There is both a genetic predisposition for this, but then also an environmental condition for this. Okay, so the way that I like to frame trauma is the survival brain. So essentially, so consider this: you're an infant, you're kind of in a home that's not very nurturing. You start to cry because crying is really the only way of expression. You're feeling unsettled, your stomach hurts or something, and you start to cry. So your caregiver, your parent, comes in and they just smack you. And they say, quiet. So what that does is that sets the conditions for the neurobiological reaction to try to survive. It's not about thriving now. It's not about getting my needs met. It's about really going into a survival state. I really just am trying to survive infancy now. And so what I like to do here is I like to acknowledge the innate intelligence of trauma. Really what it's doing is it's going into a state where it can survive insurmountable odds. And that's really one of the reasons why humans, we've proliferated so much, is because we're really, really good at survival. Our nervous systems have these kind of wonderful defense structures that emerge that really protect us. And if anything, what it does is it gets you to a point where you can get help. So, when, if you've experienced trauma and you're starting to get help from a counselor or you're working with a psychiatrist, really your brain, your trauma has really brought you there. It's allowed you to get to a place where you can heal. So another reason why I like to frame trauma as survival is because a lot of times when I do brain maps, and one of the series will talk about brain maps, but when I was doing brain maps with some of the kids that I worked with, a lot of the brain maps are very objective. So it's kind of like, okay, this part of your brain isn't working here, and this part of your brain is maybe damaged, and you might have like some, instabilities here. And I realized really quickly when I was communicating that information to some of my kids that really what that would do is that would just kind of trigger them into what we call these kind of shame spirals. It would really confirm or really kind of collaborate with their own self-deprecating thinking, which is I am broken, and now this brain map is really just is confirming that information. So the way that I like to frame the brain scans, and later we'll talk more about these brain scans, but I like to frame it as these are these defense structures that you have activated in order to protect yourself to get to this point in your life. So again, trauma is really about the brain just trying to survive. So in that survival, we get kind of these energy kind of efficiency. The brain shuts down parts of itself in order to reallocate those resources to different systems. So a lot of times when people experience trauma, developmental trauma or PTSD or generational trauma, these particular systems are impacted. The immune system, for example, gets impacted. It's not really very important to remove pathogens from the inside of your body when you're trying to just survive a physical attack, or some type of neglect or something. That the immune system takes a lot of energy, so we'll just kind of bring back some of the energy from the immune system, and then we'll reallocate those resources to more reactionary systems that are going to help us to survive. Same thing with digestion. Digestion also gets kind of shut off. We're not putting energy into the digestive system. We're conserving energy here. And that's the reason why a lot of times people with trauma have like digestion or metabolic issues. But when we look at the brain, the most like developed part of the nervous system is the prefrontal cortex and the frontal cortex. It takes about 27 years, 25 to 27 years for this part of the brain to really develop. And the reason for that is that the frontal lobes and the prefrontal cortex, they're really designed to adapt to culture. They're really designed to adapt to your community and try to incorporate what you're learning throughout your life into the rest of your nervous system. However, if you're in a survival state, if you're in this survival brain, the prefrontal cortex doesn't really become useful because actually the prefrontal cortex and the frontal cortex, it takes a lot of time to use. And so when you're in a survival brain, you want to be able to react quickly. You want to be able to react as fast as you can to situations. You want to be able to sum up a situation, determine the safest route, and then engage in that behavior or engage in that particular process. So a lot of times with trauma, people will shut down, unconsciously will shut down their prefrontal cortex, which then also impacts their ability for attention and prioritization and decision making. The prefrontal cortex is really about impulse control, like stopping yourself from doing things. It's also related to doing the hard thing when it's the right thing to do. So a lot of times when people have experienced trauma and this part of their brain has shut down, they really struggle with doing the hard thing when it's the right thing to do. So you can't really expect them to do the quote unquote right thing because they don't really have the neurological predispositions to do that. So another part is called the insular cortex. And the insular cortex, what this system does is it takes all of our unconscious bodily sensations and experiences, and it brings it up into our conscious awareness. So it kind of brings the subconscious into our consciousness. So that would include things like, if you're hungry, or if you're feeling uncomfortable, or if you're feeling sad, or you're feeling overwhelmed. Any emotion that you can think of takes place in the body. And then the insular cortex, what it does is it brings that up into your awareness, and it says, hey, you're feeling sad, or you're feeling angry, or you're feeling pain, or you're feeling uncomfortable, or you're feeling hungry. So a lot of times this part of the brain gets shut off, and it's a wonderful defense, because if I can shut myself off from my body, then I don't have to feel the pain of life. I don't have to feel the emotions. So oftentimes, I don't know why that happened. Maybe it's on a timer. So oftentimes what'll happen is when the insular cortex shuts off, I'll talk to a client and I'll say, hey, I want to talk about your emotions. Let's talk about your feelings of insecurity or your feelings of abandonment. And they'll kind of just look at me like, what? Like, I don't really feel that. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. So people who experience trauma typically get cut off from their body and their emotions. And again, it's a conservation of resources here. The last one is the default mode network. And this is a system, this is a network in the brain that really encapsulates your sense of identity. So everything that you think you are. So when you go and you spend time with your mother and you spend time with your best friend or your loved one or your child or a coworker, different aspects of your personality emerge. You're kind of, different people in different places and different situations. And all of these different behaviors and interactions are stored in this network called the default mode network. And so oftentimes with trauma, this particular system doesn't really activate, doesn't really engage. It takes up a lot of resources. So maintaining a sense of self actually takes up a lot of resources. But then what happens is that people who have experienced trauma don't get to connect with their self. And because they don't get to connect with their self, they get incoherent narratives about who they are. They also really struggle with meaning and purpose. What is my meaning and purpose in life? Well, I don't know, because I don't really have a sense of self to have a meaning and purpose. So trauma really impacts that, and predominantly, again, for this conservation of energy. Okay, so the essence of trauma from like a psychological perspective is really shame. So probably 99% of the people that I've worked with that have experienced, some type of trauma, whether it's developmental or PTSD or generational, typically have a psychological narrative that revolves around shame. And shame is really either the implicit memory or literally the conscious thought of, I'm not lovable, feelings of unworthiness, I'm a burden to my family, imposter syndrome is kind of alluding to shame, I'm a fake, I'm not real, feeling broken, there's something wrong with me, I'm broken. I don't deserve help. I hear that a lot. A lot of times with addiction, people don't deserve help. And so they just kind of continue with these self-sabotaging behaviors. And I'm not accepted. So I am not accepted. So I go and I spend time with people, and everyone here thinks I'm a terrible person, but really they don't. I'm just kind of projecting that information into them. Now, what I have on the right side here is this is some QEEG information. And this is a biomarker for shame. And what it really is looking at is it's looking at the power differentiation between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And so using QEEG, we can kind of get at some of these shameful narratives. And there's usually two manifestations of this, and we'll get into this a little bit more, but one manifestation is kind of the difficulty with positive regard or receiving positive regard. So a lot of times in some cases of trauma, you can go up to them and you can say, hey, like you're a wonderful person and I love you and I care for you and I want the best for you, or you're really smart, or you're not a failure. You can say those things very directly to them. And there's a part of their nervous system that just will not accept it. It just blocks it. And that this is taking place in this left hemisphere, but it just blocks that receptivity to positive regard. And as a consequence, typically people who have this particular biomarker really struggle with what I call pro-social behavior. And pro-social behavior is the idea that, like, all right, so let's say, my mom calls me up and it's during the holidays and she's like, hey, I want you to come to Christmas, or I want to come to the holidays and we're gonna have a party. If my reaction to that is, oh man, I'm gonna have to like get my dogs and I have to drive and it's gonna be 2 hours and then I have to listen to my brother talk about annoying things and my mom's gonna just badger me about X, Y, and Z. So if that's my reaction, then that would be the antithesis of pro-social. Now, if I think, oh, this is gonna be awesome, I'm gonna get to hang out with my brother and I'm gonna get to see my family and it's gonna be great, then that would be an example of pro-social. It's essentially the excitement over spending time with other people. So a lot of times with trauma, that particular system gets shut off. The other variation of this is going to be self-deprecation, which is, again, this is going to be more of the quintessential essence of trauma, which is I'm not lovable, I'm unworthy, I'm a failure. All these kind of narratives come up in the mind when we see this biomarker over here. Okay, let's see, go back. I don't know why am I. So as a result of these kind of self-deprecating thoughts and this difficulty, receptivity, positive regard, what happens in the body is their tolerance for stress decreases. So we call this the window of tolerance, which is to say that we want to be able to manage a certain amount of stress. Like we want to be able to manage, a good amount actually. We want to be able to have healthy conflict. We want to be able to engage in discussion where, people are challenging us. We want to, we want to respond to emergencies. We want to be able to experience stress and tolerate it, not get into a fight, flight, freeze response. Now, what we know with trauma is that a lot of times their window of tolerance gets smaller, meaning it's kind of the quintessential, like the toothpick that broke the camel's back. These people are more sensitive to stress. They can't handle as much stress. They're more likely to go into a fight, flight, freeze response than someone whose window of tolerance is larger. So they're constantly on edge, and they struggle with the ability to receive criticism, like constructive criticism. So if I were to, go up to someone with trauma that has this kind of short window of tolerance and give them some feedback, hey, that thing you did the other day, that wasn't really great. I'd like you to do this. This would be better. They might kind of think of that as like an attack, like, oh, they think I'm a terrible person. And then all that self-deprecation kind of emerges, and it confirms all the things that they already think about themselves. So oftentimes they become very reactive. Okay, so consequences of shame, and we talked about some of these, but the consequences of shames are maladaptive self-regulation techniques. And so that basically what that is that a lot of the symptoms and the defenses that the people who experience trauma go through are designed to self-regulate, but they're just not the best type of self-regulation. So that's why I describe them as maladaptive. Eventually, if you engage in these particular self-regulation techniques for a long time, it just creates kind of a downward spiral. But a lot of times with people with these biomarkers and that experience trauma, they'll seek out unhealthy relationships. And essentially, this is because, relatively speaking, if I have self-deprecation, I'm not good enough, I'm a failure, I'm not, worthy of love, I'm broken, I don't deserve help. If those are my narratives, then if I spend time with people who are healthy, then relatively speaking, I feel worse about myself, because not only do I already feel bad about myself, but now these people are going to witness it, and their lives are all better. And so relatively speaking, it's going to feel even worse. And so I'm just going to seek out unhealthy relationships, people who are also quote unquote broken or also struggling with their own issues and problems. So I feel a sense of more acceptance, or I don't feel that relative shame because I'm not constantly in relationship with people who are healthy. So the example that I give here is take a 42-year-old man. He's lives with his mom, and he smokes, pot all day, and he plays video games, and he's got bad hygiene and not a very good diet. And so in the mail comes his 20-year reunion for high school. So if this individual were to go to this 20-year reunion, there's going to be, kind of successful people. So to go to that high school reunion is really just going to be a highlighting. You're going to feel judgment of, I didn't amount to anything while all of my peers did. So I'm going to avoid that. I'm not going to go spend time with people that are potentially healthy. Now, as far as seeking addiction is concerned, there's a great practitioner, psychiatrist out there by the name of Gabor Mate. So, and you can email me if you want this name again. But Gabor Mate talks about addiction as a manifestation of trauma. So, addiction really is going to be two parts. One is it's going to be the self-regulation. So I feel terrible about myself, or I feel overwhelmed, so I'm going to seek out THC or alcohol or heroin or or some other type of substance. And then it's also an escape. So, if my life is just really terrible, so I'm going to seek out this substance to kind of numb myself out from all of this self-deprecating that I'm experiencing. But I put this into the category of maladaptive self-regulation because a lot of times people who engage in addictions, it prevents them from harming themselves or harming others, or, God forbid, committing suicide. So addictions can be kind of positive in a way, but again, the maladaptive self-regulation is as they engage in this for long periods of time, it just creates a downward spiral and typically a lot of pain in their relationships with the people that love them. Suicidal ideation is another maladaptive self-regulation. Sometimes, basically, suicidal ideation comes from the idea that the pain that I'm experiencing is so intense that I see no end. So just considering or thinking about suicidal ideation tends to make me feel better. So if I have control over when I can end things, then it's going to make me feel better about myself. I have a choice. I have an out. So a lot of times when I talk to, students or people with trauma, a lot of times they'll have a lot of suicidal ideation. And again, it becomes this maladaptive self-regulation. And we talked about the resistance to positive regard, difficulty with loving relationships. Now, the defense of this is pretty simple, which is to say it's a protection of two things. If I don't allow myself to receive positive regard from other people, then essentially what I can do is I can prevent people from manipulating me. Because again, people who have experienced trauma find themselves in very unhealthy situations, and those people around me are going to potentially manipulate me. So the kind of quintessential example of this is, let's say I'm talking to a friend of mine and I say, hey, wow, your hair is so beautiful, and like your clothes, just what you're doing today just is really doing it. Like you're looking great today. And then I follow that up with, oh, and by the way, can I borrow $50? Or hey, can you buy me some dinner? So the idea there is positive regard can be used as a manipulation technique. So what people do is that they essentially try to shut that off. Now, the second part of it too is that it protects them from getting their hopes up. It protects them from feeling good because, in a weird way, when we access positive emotions, the brain doesn't really discriminate between negative and positive emotions. When we access the body and we access emotions, we get access to the whole spectrum. We get access to positive, but we also get access to negative. So oftentimes when we feel good about ourselves, we open ourselves to all the bad that we felt in our life too. So it's, again, resistance to positive regard can be a protective mechanism against my own feelings of pain. And then we talked about the bullying. The idea here is that if I am in unhealthy relationships or if I find people around me and I put them down, there's actually a good feeling that comes from that. And this kind of comes from, I don't know, some like chimpanzee baboon DNA that we as humans still have, but we feel good when we put other people down, when we can feel like we're better than someone else. So a lot of times people have experienced trauma, what they'll do is that they will become bullies, or they'll get into relationships with other unhealthy people, and then they'll put them down so that they can make themselves feel better about who they are. So relatively speaking, I'm better than someone else. Okay, so the physiological consequences of trauma, and this comes from what's called the Adverse Childhood Experience Questionnaire. And actually, if you were to type that into Google, Adverse Childhood Experience or ACE scores, you'll get a bunch of websites that you can actually take this exam yourself, and it's 10 questions. And each one of those questions is going to ask you about adverse childhood experiences. And the higher the number goes, there's just tons of research around this. The higher the number, the higher the correlation to disease, early death, and mental health disorders. So what these researchers have found is that the more adverse childhood experiences that people have, the more likely that their bodies are going to degenerate. They're going to be exposed to something called toxic stress, which just puts a burden on the organs. It puts a burden on the biological systems, and then those systems can become unhealthy and stop functioning and working properly. So if you type this in, take the questionnaire. I think I've got some examples here. So some examples of the question are like, did a parent or other adult in the household often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? So you would just put a yes or no, you'd put a 1. And then as you kind of go down the list, and over here you can see that this is the list over here. Again, you would tally the amount of ones that you have. The higher the score, the more likely that there's going to be a correlation with some type of physical disease or early death. It's just fascinating stuff. Okay, so trauma as delay of development. So trauma, basically, what we've found is that it delays your development. And so we look at this biomarker called hyperconnectivity, and this is again going to be in the brain scan, and we'll talk more about this in one of the later webinars. But what this essentially is measuring is differentiation of the brain. And differentiation of the brain is essentially, let's take the example of an infant. You're an infant. You're learning gross motor skills. You're kind of flailing your arms around, and you're just trying to figure out how to use your arms, and you're kind of hitting yourself in the head, and eventually you stop doing that. And then eventually what happens is you start to develop fine motor skills. You can get your fingers and your digits and all that kind of stuff to work. And so what's happening here is the real estate in the brain is differentiating. Different parts of the nervous system are being allocated to different functions and systems. So you have a part of the brain that is now working your fingers. You have a part of your brain that's working your arms. So hypercoherence is a measurement of that differentiation over time. So what we've found is that when you have what's called hyperconnectivity, it means the brain has not differentiated. It means that it's still in a previous state of development. So a lot of times with complex developmental trauma, what we see is 16-year-olds or even 18-year-olds acting like 5-year-olds or acting like 10-year-olds. And the reason for that is that we go into that survival state. Again, the main objective is survival. It's not development. And so you get locked into these developmental stages. And so you don't, develop morality, or you don't develop a sense of belonging. You don't develop these kind of developmental milestones, and you kind of stay locked. It's kind of the example that I give here is kind of using the same tool over and over again. Or if you only have one tool, you're going to see the world as, one thing. Or like if you see the world as a nail, and you've got a hammer. Or if you only got a hammer, you're going to see the world as a nail. Like that kind of situation, which is, I'm just going to try to solve every problem the same way over and over again. So it's not unheard of for, an 18-year-old to throw a temper tantrum, because that's where they're kind of locked in. That's where their differentiation was established. Okay, so interventions. These are the next 4 webinars that we're going to talk about, but these are all the interventions that I utilize personally to help people manage their trauma, to recover, to develop, to heal, to those types of things. So we've got, QEEG brain maps and neurofeedback. And so a brain map is basically going to look at the nervous system. Some of the biomarkers that I talked about just now, those are in the QEEG scan. So do you have the hyperconnectivity? Has your nervous system not developed? Is there that asymmetry? Is the left hemisphere shut down, or is the right hemisphere overactivated? Is that contributing to self-deprecation and shame? We can look at the QEEG brain map and kind of figure out where these defense structures and these survival systems are either online or not online. We can look at the default mode network in the insular and the prefrontal cortex. And then we can use neurofeedback as a training tool. And neurofeedback is kind of like a gym for the brain. You're basically just training your nervous system to activate or deactivate to remediate certain symptoms. So you can train your brain to focus more. You can train your brain to be less depressed. You can train your nervous system to activate the insular cortex. So now you can feel emotions. The second one is going to be brain spotting, which is more of a psychotherapy. And brain spotting is really just, if for some of you who know about EMDR, it's kind of an advanced version of EMDR. It's essentially trying to isolate what we call implicit memories, which are nonverbal memories, memories that don't have any visual information or any auditory information attached to it. They're more of just feelings. And what brain spotting is doing is it's trying to help the person to discharge those feelings, those implicit memories, so that they're no longer affecting your perceptions. A lot of times with trauma, implicit memories are going to be like feelings of unworthiness or not being lovable or broken. And so you really want to essentially get that out of the system. Heart rate variability and mindfulness. This is about self-regulation. Heart rate variability is essentially controlling the heart. How do I control my heart? Because if you can control your heart, you can you can predispose yourself to certain emotional states. The heart is very critical in emotional states. So when you're feeling uncomfortable and anxious, the heart rate goes up. When you're feeling calm and relaxed, the heart rate goes down. And then we'll talk about this, but there's a variability within that. And based on those variabilities, set the condition for certain emotional states. And then the last one we're going to talk about is sensory integration. A lot of times with trauma, what happens is the sensory systems get disorganized. So basically, it's kind of garbage in, garbage out. I'm not getting accurate information about the world around me. And so I'm having a hard time really just interacting with the world in an authentic way because I don't really know what's going on. So if I have hyperacusis, my ears are really sensitive. And so because they're sensitive, I tend to shy away from people. And because of that, I feel anxious all the time. Then I'm going to interpret the world as being very threatening, even though the world isn't threatening. My sensory systems are just dysregulated. So there's a protocol that's called safe and sound protocol, and we'll go into that and how that kind of trains the ear to relax and go into different frequencies to kind of predispose the body towards more calm and regulated states. Okay, I think that is a bunch of information. If we have some time, we can maybe ask some questions, or let me go ahead and stop presenting here. Okay. Oh, we went 10 minutes over. Sorry, everyone that needed to get they needed to get to some place. Do we have time for questions, or are we just done?
Thank you so much, Scott. You know, you may have went over, but I don't think anyone jumped off.
Great. Excellent. I'm glad that that was engaging. I hope that information was helpful. Again, I just try to pack in a lot of information. So if questions come up, concerns come up, please feel free to reach out to me at that email, and I can direct you into resources or just answer your question.
Wonderful. I don't see any questions coming up in the chat. So, Scott, I think I just see a good comment. Excellent presentation. Would love a resource list.
Absolutely. Yeah, let me get that together, and then I'll email it to you.
Awesome. Yeah, I think people are just trying to consume the information they just heard. Um, maybe questions will come to you during the week or save them for next week when we see you again.
That's perfect. Yeah, it looks like there's a lot of positive responses here. Yeah, very informative. We need more time. I agree with you, Anita. And you guys are very welcome. I'm so appreciative that you guys are interested in this topic, because this is, again, a very important topic for our culture and our communities.
And Scott, maybe I'll email you after the call. Maybe we can discuss lengthening our session.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that wouldn't be very difficult.
Okay. I mean, I love all the feedback everyone's saying could have used more time, so I'd love to make that happen if we can. Not making any promises to anybody.
Okay, yeah, that's fair.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for your attention. I appreciate the interest.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Scott. I can't wait to hear from you again next Tuesday.
Yeah, and I'm excited about talking to you guys about. So we're going to talk about QEEGs and neurofeedback next Tuesday.
Okay. Sounds good. Bye, guys.
All right. Take care.